With more than 270 million people, Indonesia has Southeast Asia's largest population, and it's the fourth most populous country in the world. Growing by more than 2 million people every year, Indonesia's demand for food is predicted to quadruple by 2050, offering massive export opportunities for its Asia-Pacific neighbours. Dr. Jared Greenville is Executive Director of ABARES, the Australian Bureau of Agricultural and Resource Economics and Sciences. He joins us to discuss what this all means for producers. Jared, thanks a lot for joining us. These numbers are staggering. What food categories do you expect will be in the highest demand in the Indonesian market in the short term?
Yeah, so there's certainly some staggering numbers there with that population growth coupled with income growth and what we call as urbanisation. So people moving to cities, changes their diets and the like. So there's a few things in the short term, which things we already trade, particularly with meat and live animals, but as a undercurrent of growth are things that we produce here which they can't produce. So we're talking kind of cooler climates, fruits and vegetables in particular, where we'll see big growth, and we're well served to meet those demands. And so we see that across grapes, and we see it in terms of citrus in particular.
And how much do you think Indonesia is sort of following what happened in China and India in terms of the expansion of their middle classes and the demand for different kind of products?
Yeah, so it seems to be following a similar path, particularly to what we've seen in China. So those things I mentioned at the start that are really kind of core to what we see is linked to diet change and therefore linked to food consumption. And so as we have that growing GDP per capita in particular, as that lifts people out of poorer households and into that middle class, people generally start to move into cities and have jobs in cities, and those things have that driving effect in changing diets and consumption. We've seen Indonesia do that quite rapidly, as well as a number of other countries in Southeast Asia, and would expect India as well to start to pick up and really drive in later times in the future. But certainly we've been through that in China already.
How much of a role will new technologies play in leveraging export output and maximising yields?
Yeah, so both within Australia and Indonesia, there's huge potential there. So new technologies already we're starting to put in place in Australia to optimise things like fertiliser use, to get better insight as to movements of cattle on large stations, so watering and feed supplements and all those kind of things can come together, and that boosts the output that we have. It also is important for things like traceability, to make sure that you know where your foods come from, there's provenance in the supply chain. If something were to go wrong, we could be able to trace it back and so forth. Those potentials exist everywhere, and in particular in countries, in developing countries where there are big gaps between what would say productivity gaps, or yield gaps and so forth, where there's a chance to catch up. And so we'd expect that to flow through across Southeast Asia as well.
Now, we are seeing that growth of Indonesia's middle class, but at the same time, Indonesia's poverty rate is estimated to be around 10% of a very big population, exacerbated by the pandemic. How will the likelihood of rapidly increasing food imports impact them, and will food be more or less expensive?
So we would expect to see that food imported in is generally a bit cheaper than that produced domestically, depending on the regime that's in place. So we do know that Indonesia has a number of trade barriers that have influenced their ability to import and the price that imports come in. As if they would get broken down and they look to international markets to help supplement their own domestic supply, that food effectively would come in at a cheaper price and help provide food to some of the poorer populations, be it directly or through alleviating price pressures elsewhere in the supply chain.
Indonesia's complex regulatory framework has traditionally made it difficult for producers to navigate their way into this market. So is this likely to change, do you think?
I think over time, as the pressure of rising demand and, trying to deal with those issues you mentioned before about, large numbers of the population still in precarious kind of food security kind of situations, will mean that these kind of external, barriers or frictions to international trade will still have to be looked at. And in the short term, I guess we still expect that to be, some frictions there, but Australia is developing closer ties in particular with Indonesia. We've got the free trade agreement now, a number of abilities within that agreement to get at and to talk at some of these issues and to find, less frictions in the way of kind of meeting what Indonesia wants to achieve through these measures, but doing it in a way that doesn't unduly restrict trade.
We did see Australia's newly elected Prime Minister Anthony Albanese make his first bilateral visit to Indonesia recently. So how much of this story is dependent on collaboration? Is this the ideal time for the Australian agricultural sector to start working with its Indonesian counterparts to innovate on low carbon farming practices, a scalable ag tech and sustainable supply chains, for example?
Yeah, it is a good time. And so that trade that we have does really give us the overarching framework to allow us to bring things to the table, look at different areas of cooperation and really start to, work together to come at some of these frictions, but also importantly, as you mentioned, to look at adoption of practices and to share knowledge and experience in the way that things are produced so that, things like low carbon or reducing carbon out of agriculture production systems can be really important and achievable. So I think now's a good time as governments start to talk together, so can industry at the same time, and just really kind of open up those dialogues.
But what are other markets around Asia Pacific do you believe will significantly step up their food imports over the decades ahead? I guess ASEAN is an area where we will see that. Yeah,
so ASEAN is an area where there's going to be increasing trade in food products overall. ASEAN's a diverse group of members, spans different hemispheres in terms of production cycles and the like. So there's a natural kind of trade relationship that exists in amongst those members, coupled with that with some of the countries such as Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Japan, that they already have pre-existing trade agreements and closer relationships with, really opens up that whole area to be a fairly dynamic kind of trading system when it comes to food products, where there's things that are produced in each of those countries where there's room for beneficial trade. That will have two impacts really. It helps grow the agriculture sectors everywhere collectively, which means better rural incomes, which often addresses some of the food security issues, but it also importantly reduces the overall price of food. So I think when we look overall, even though we've got some big agricultural powerhouses in ASEAN, such as Thailand and potentially Myanmar when it's more open to trade, then there's good potential there as a group.
And I guess for Australia, with the uncertainty over the trade relationship with China, it just makes sense for Australia to explore new markets in ASEAN and across Asia Pacific.
Yeah, that's right. So Australia's done very well and had overall, despite the more recent disruptions, a very good trading relationship with China. We've had those issues, with with barley, with rock lobster and with wine. Having options in all those instances has been what's really important. So for barley, although we got locked out of China, we've managed to find other markets. For other products, it's been less successful. But really important is that suite of options and having a number of different agreements and a number of different relationships in place to allow exports to pivot when and if they need to.
Dr. Jared Greenville, thank you very much, Executive Director of ABARES, Australian Bureau of Agricultural and Resource Economics and Sciences. It's been an interesting discussion. Thanks again.
Excellent. Thank you very much.